Good morning, Property and Propenomix people, and hello, Propenomix people, and welcome to yet another Sunday Supplement live with me, Adam Lawrence. So, this week, well, if you've listened before, you'll know I like to start with a quote. And this week's quote is, "Many leaders attempted to lead like a chess master, striving to control every move when they should be leading like gardeners, creating and maintaining a viable ecosystem in which the organisation operates." And that was General Stanley A. McChrystal, retired US Army General. So that talks straight to the deep dive section of today's efforts and will provide some suggestions to the very top if they're listening as well. Would that they were. So, and before we crack on in proper, I just want to recognise one more great property business workshop that we held in London this week about investment metrics, and scaling your property businesses safely and sensibly, managing risks well. Rob Turner was on fire, and I managed to fan the flames from the sidelines as I tried to. Some fantastic feedback from all the attendees, and we've set our next date for Thursday, the 22nd of January 2026. So pop that in your diaries. We'll be talking about goal setting, productivity, and also accounting and bookkeeping, where we regularly see some consistent mistakes being made within property businesses. Alongside, as always, real-life case studies about our own experiences and businesses. Save the date because the link will be with you next week. So, Trumpwatch, where are we at as we get into Q4? Well, the circus of the debt ceiling is the biggie this week as markets start flying blind without, for example, the September payroll data. The technical line is that the visibility gap complicates rate path assumptions. Black market data must have its own market here, I tell you. The manufacturing ISM numbers in the States were 49.1, so that's contracting, not as badly as the UK numbers, mind. Tariffs got some very chunky numbers in, though, topping up tax revenue by 62.6 billion, lifting it from the margins of businesses and the pockets of consumers, in variable ratios depending on the end products. We're a month or so away from the first arguments being heard in the Supreme Court about the tariffs. The number is around $1,300 per household in terms of estimated costs on the consumer side this year. But they've raised plenty of revenue, of course. Traded volumes were down on future interest rate cuts, but the lean is still towards one more cut this year by the Fed, which has been the case for a good month or so anyway. As you'd expect, the conviction in that decision is down, but there's been no reason to change direction because there's no data, right? Large-scale workforce cuts on non-statutory government departments are what's been floated. Doge rides on as the Senate failed to advance competing bills around funding. As you'd expect, Mr. Trump has been accused of leveraging the shutdown. Now, if there's one thing he's a master of, it's leverage, let's face it. Not necessarily with great consequences for everybody, mind, but usually with great consequences for him. There were $187 million in cuts to counter-terror grants in New York, which was U-turned in the same week as there was major Republican blowback. But it was a quieter week, all in all, stateside. And my favourite piece of rhetoric this week was, AI writes good, maybe better than fake news, which was the Donald's response to the leak of an internal memo showing that his comms team have used GPT-based drafting for recent rally remarks. There was also a proposed Trump Liberty Tower slid into planning in New York without city consultation. Straight to court first of all, then. I guess he knows the system that well. That's how he feels he needs to play it because it's going there one way or another. So why not go straight to court? Inevitably, it's a commercial decision because that's faster. What a world we live in. And then a lettuce placed outside the Treasury also caught my eye in the US this week. It had a little mini Make America Great Again hat on and a sign saying still outlasting fiscal policy. A comment on the number of changes this year that will no doubt continue, particularly when it comes to tariffs. Of course, there have been over 150 different tariff policy announcements made this year. So the lettuce has gone international. Okay, over the pond then, back to our real-time UK property market. Chris Watkin delivers as always. Week 38 is in the can. Listings 35,300. That was the last full week of September because remember we run about a week behind on those. And we still have 10% more stock than the average market. 1.38 million homes listed for sale this year so far already, and a quarter yet to go. 10.5% ahead of the 9-year average, but we're still creeping back towards the 2024 listing number. We're only 2.6% ahead of 2024's number at this stage now. And then price reductions, 25,000, right? for the week. So in August, we only had 11.1% of reductions. We will have more data next week. We've had over 100,000 price reductions in the last month. So if you're telling me you can't find a deal, just get on with it. You'll get there in the end. There's over 100,000 houses on the market that have been reduced in the last month, let alone in the last 6 months, right? There'll be hundreds of thousands of those still there. And then 25,000 homes sold subject to contract, healthy enough. The year average is 26.1k. And on average, this week, week 38, prints 24,800 over the past 9 years. So we're about healthy enough, really, which is the sort of thing that I've been saying. The demand side is pretty functional. There's some more stuff on that later. Sold subjects are up 5.6 year on year. And as we said, the listings are up 2.6. So a bit more healthy market than 2024, a bit more intention to transact is what I've been saying. And then we had 736,333 homes on the market as we went into September. Be interesting to see whether that number's up or down for October. It's usually been a bit of a clear out for August. So normally a net listing month, September, so you'd expect it to go upwards. But I'm watching this trend closely because that's sort of over 700k number. It really is a lot of homes on the market. You expect a functional market to be more like sort of 650-ish, and anything under 600 is tending towards the seller's market a bit more. We were below 500 in the 2021s of the world, but of course the pandemic did create this artificial shutdown situation, so we don't need to read too much into that, but we do know the market was absolutely white hot at that point in time. End of August 24, there was 710,000 on the market, so that's how it compares year on year. We had about 25,000 more than the year before, but 2024 was a glut of listings year. As I say, when we look more into 10-year historical context, I think that's a more relevant number. And then still, just for one last time, reporting on August's sales per square foot, that normally is a pretty good predictor around August time of roughly where we end up at the end of the year. And we're only 1.4% up year on year and only 14.25% up on August 2020. So much calmer, especially that second number, than most of the numbers show in general. It's usually a blend between sort of July and August number and then expands out a bit. There's a lot of correlation, 92% correlation between that sold subject to contract per square foot number and the land reg 5 months hence. So a loose description of where we move out for December 2025. But let's see. And as it's August, I'm always a little bit more cautious as well. Fall throughs printed 24.6, very, very close to the long-term average of 24.2. Nothing massive. Net sales just under 19,000 for the week, still nearly 5% ahead of last year and 10% higher than the pre-pandemic market. So things certainly seem to be functioning, given that people are paying plenty more for their mortgages, or at least a decent slug more, not necessarily plenty more these days, but a decent slug more than they were paying in 2017 to 19. We're only 8,000 net sales behind 2022. So there's absolutely no doubt in my mind now we're going to absolutely blow past that 2022 number, because the final few months of 2022, of course, next week we'll be reporting on and comparing to a week in 2022 where there's absolute carnage in the wake of the mini budget complete shambles that there was. And then one more graph I also mentioned last week, but it's worth bringing up again. How many average rental properties are added to the market each month? So this is not sort of new rentals. This is re-rentals. There will be some new ones in there, of course. The number historically has been around 350,000 pre-pandemic. Our new normal looks at about 300,000 at the moment. So it's about 14% down on availability compared to pre-pandemic. But we had a low of 243,000 in 2023. So that was when the rental market was its most constricted and rents were, frankly, ridiculous. But anyone saying the PRS hasn't shrunk in size in the last few years, I don't think he's being that objective in my view. But we'll have to wait and see for the English Housing Survey. There are a number of bits that show more sideways than forward. I think the view that I'm developing, especially as I talk to more and more people and more vendors, is that ultimately what's happening is people are holding on to stuff they never would buy in today's day and age as an investment, but they're not selling it yet. And whether there will be, and there's plenty of chatter about national insurance on landlords specifically in their own name, I mean, this would just be inherently ridiculously unfair, wouldn't it? I'm not against the idea of equalising income tax across earned and unearned income, but picking on landlords and then picking on tenants specifically would be a horrific way to do it. But it might be part of the government plan to get the little guys and girls out and get the big corporates and institutions in who, as I've been saying over recent weeks, are most definitely sniffing around like they never have done before, in my experience. So Chris always gets a weekly shout out here. Thanks to Chris for doing what he does. At Christopher Watkin on his YouTube, check out him on the Property Industry Eye website. And if you want some business support in growing your property business, being a more effective communicator, appearing to be and being more in touch with your local market, that's his core business. So give him a shout alongside a follow, a like, a subscribe, and all the rest of it. And if you give me one as well at the same time, I'd very much appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, on to the macro side of things. Macro fog is the word I've used this week because it is a week where things became less clear rather than more. We had Bank of England money and credit report data with the mortgage approvals and some money supply stuff, which I want to talk about. The nationwide house price index, which is a good one because it's a quarterly one. And then we had the final PMIs, and bad news, the data was quite a bit worse than the flash numbers I reported on last week that already were not great. And then in position 4, we know it's the gilts and swaps. So money and credit report, business as usual, pretty much month on month. But, August didn't break any patterns. We still had about 65,000 mortgage approvals that month. So it certainly wasn't quiet in terms of that side of things. We were down like 500 on the month, 64,700. I wouldn't read anything into that. Remortgages staying as they've been in the high 30,000s, printing 37,900. That was 900 down month on month. Now that only counts, remember, it only counts people who remortgage by moving lender. It doesn't count product transfers. So that's an important distinction to draw. Large businesses borrowed 8.6% more year on year than they did the 12 months before. Small businesses borrowed 1.2% more. And that's the best print for 4 years. So SMEs have just not been in a position, not been able to borrow. You could argue as well with bounce back loans and the likes, they meant more, C-bills, coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. That stuff maybe had more impact in the small business arena than in the large business arena. So there would be an argument for that. But of course, lots of those loans have expired by now, although many bounce back loans have been drawn out for the 10 years, of course. So still good to see, although it's a bit paltry, really. I like the effective interest rate. I like to draw that out of this report. And that the drawn rate was 4.26. That's the average rate at which a new mortgage was drawn down for August. And the whole stock of outstanding debt is at 3.89. So those two are converging more and more as we go on, 37 basis points away from converging. So we look like we're within the 12 months now of those two converging, around about that sort of level. And that's the market thinks, in terms of base rate bottoms, we're at either 3.75 or 3.5 in a year's time. That's the current prevailing wisdom from the financial markets. Personal loans could go more expensive, 8.32, but interest charging credit cards were down 23 basis points. And they only cost 21.42% these days. Little reminder there to use 0% interest-free periods if you're getting involved in credit cards in any way, shape or form. Household deposits went up by 5.4 billion on the month. They were up 7.1 billion in July. So it just shows you how much households grow their stock of wealth and savings every month into instant access accounts and ISAs in a nearly 50-50 range as it goes. And then large companies are paying 5.68% on their debt on average, compared to 6.35% for SMEs. That's their new debt, of course. The money supply was up 0.4% month on month. That's measured by M4, a whole number of metrics for the money supply. But the expectation was 0.2, so 0.4 smells a bit inflationary. There's now been a 1% increase in M4 over the past 3 months, which is very congruent with this September expected CPI print of 4%. Or a little over. There's no calm coming from the money supply side of the fence either. So we've got inflationary pressures, whichever school of economics you prefer. Then nationwide house price index. Well, a bit of fanfare. The print was up 0.5% on the month. The expectation was 0.2. The consensus still seems to struggle to predict anything correctly month to month. Remember, this is September as the nationwide make a concerted effort to stay real time. So what was their adjective of choice in their reporting? Steady. Annual number 2.2. It was 2.1 last month. Northern Ireland surging on at 9.6% year on year as it booms on post-Brexit. Nationwide chief economist comments on stability and the close parallel of mortgage approvals to the pre-pandemic market, in spite of the large changes of interest rates in the interim. A lot of his rhetoric looks like it hasn't been revisited for a few months, to be honest with you. Unemployment is low, so no focus from him there on how much it's rising. Earnings are rising at a healthy pace. Well, yeah, but so is inflation, and earnings are trending down and inflation is trending up. And borrowing costs will moderate a little further. Now, probably true on the 2-year as the rate does continue to get clipped a little bit, but I'm still pretty skeptical or fixated on what looks like a very stable 5-year bond rate and has done for about 18 months or so. So his conclusion of gradual strengthening in the market, which I do agree with in fairness, even if his economic chat is a little over positive or a little bit light on reality. The quarters also signify a new quarter of data on Nationwide's hidden real house price index. So you have to find this by Googling it, and it's only in a spreadsheet. There's no commentary on this anymore, but they do still update that spreadsheet quarterly. Houses got cheaper by a little over a couple of £1,000 on average in real terms in the last quarter. This has been adjusted by RPI. So I've analysed these stats a number of times over recent years. The first time I really went into detail was 9th of July 2023. If you want to look that supplement up, it's called Cheapest in 20 years. We're obviously a couple of years on from that, and it's carried on getting cheaper in real terms. So cheapest in real terms, it's a little blip in 2013, but really we're at about 2003 prices in real terms. We're 20% plus below Nationwide's trend line, but I prefer a more accurate flat trend line that reflects the market after the year 2000, in my opinion. And we're still nearly 10% below that trend line. So in terms of mean reversion, houses are, in spite of what everyone says, cheap in real terms right now. A few numbers that will bring that to life a bit. 272,819. That's the nationwide value of a house right now at the end of Q3 2025. Notable peaks, 330,809 was the real number at the end of Q1 2022. Inflation was so high that was down to 300,930 by the end of Q4 2022. So only in 9 months, it went down 10% in real terms. Incredible. And then we crossed 300,000 real on the upside back in Q1 2015, after we crossed it on the downside in Q4 2010 after the crash. Peaky McPeak face, though, historically, was Q3 2007, which probably won't surprise you too much. And that, in real terms, in today's money, houses were 361,487 on average. So that's about the most you could ever hope for before some kind of massive mental crash. But at the turn of the millennium, house prices were still 181,895 in real terms. But they were 220,253 at the end of Q2 1989. And they were as low as 123,114 at the end of Q2 1982. Now, I always say around that time, be careful with the stats, because there's so many right to buy transactions at that time with massive discounts that really skewed house prices downwards. But still, that was some 7 years to own a property and sometimes a right to buy. And I think, I've referred to that a number of times over the years, a massive transfer of wealth from the government to the people who were lucky enough to be in social housing and were able to afford to buy their property at that time. It really was probably one of the biggest events in terms of people who didn't have any or much household wealth apart from some savings, relatively modest savings, were able to massively increase their wealth at the cost of everybody else who didn't, quite frankly. But the biggest fault with all of that, not against that side of right to buy, there's an element of lottery to it, but the biggest fault was never being able to repeat that feat, and it would be many years before we could repeat that feat as a nation. So that's an idea of the sort of temporal volatility, if you like, but it also tells you why I'm so bullish underlying on house prices, right? The 20-year average nationwide real house price is £305,204. The 10-year is 304,132, and the 5-year is 298,584. So I think using 300,000 is a pretty good yardstick without us getting too far into the weeds, talking about linear regression models and things like that. But if you want to use the 20-year average, we're currently 10.6% below that 20-year average. At some point in the next decade, that 10.6 will in my opinion, be made up and probably blown past, because that's how cycles tend to work. If you add to that expected RPI inflation, which surely is 3% by anyone's money, the likely increase over the coming decade looks like about a 50% capital growth increase, which looks like a pretty fair estimate right now, as far as darts thrown at house prices across the country go. What are the other nationwide quarterly stats? Well, the usual pattern repeats. The bottom three regions in terms of performance in the past quarter are the South East, London, and the South West. The best in England are the North, then Yorkshire and the Humber, and then the North West. Nationwide do things slightly differently. I don't call it the North East for whatever reason, probably because they separate Yorkshire and Humber, I guess. Then the Midlands alongside Wales and Scotland. This is the same old story we've been seeing for a couple of years now. Which properties did best according to Nationwide? Well, semis did 3.4% annualised. Detached and terrace did 2.5 and 2.4, and flat prices are actually down 0.3% year on year. And in the past 10 years, flats are only up 20%, which is less than half the rise in the price of terraced houses over the same period. Do not buy flats, especially leasehold flats, for capital growth, folks. Do not do that. You can certainly buy it for income growth in terms of rents wise. In smaller unit, the better off the rents are doing in percentage terms. So think about that, but they also do cost a bit more in percentage terms to run. So these quarterly reports are always quite rich, and they're a welcome change from the monthly ones that are pretty light on info. But now into the PMIs. Only 10 days between the flash numbers and the finalised ones. And recently I've commented on a nice run of improvements between the flash numbers and the final prints. Guess what? Not this time. Q3 ended with a whimper. Services printed 50.8, down from 51.9 on the flash number. And that's crashed down from the 16-month August high of 54.2. It's a huge drop in the PMIs in 1 month. The composite print was therefore dragged down to 50.1. So services only just keeping manufacturing and construction above that watermark. The flash print was 51 and the August print was 53.5 on the composite. So I would have thought much more of a headline would have been made out of this. But instead, they continued to surprise me at S&P Global and just said service sector growth eases to a 5-month low. Now, it's fair to say that since September 2024, when budget fear gripped the nation, a fear that's likely back a bit, although I think the sensible business decision makers know that all the pressure is going to be on the consumer this time around. But they're also still reeling from the employees' NI shift that they were forced onto. Employers' NI, I should say. Where are the substrap lines? Slower increases in output and new orders, employment in services falling at a faster pace, strong input cost inflation persisting. Pretty bad. What about the expert commentary? Well, they badged it as a disappointing end to Q3, weak consumer confidence, delayed business spending decisions and falling exports. They literally used the words flash in the pan to describe the last 3 months. And this is the return of political and economic uncertainty. Next up, the deferral of spending decisions until after the budget. And then I can't really see them being made in December. Much more likely to be January 2026 before the trigger is pulled by many. Lackluster demand reported across Europe, 12 months of falling employment. We already know that the only expansion in employment is the public sector at this time. The analysis wraps by saying there will be more support for rate cutting on the back of this sort of print. That's drawing the positives out of it. Same story in manufacturing, but worse because it started from a weaker base. UK industry is not well. The JLR cyber attack was also meaningful enough to get a mention and have an impact. Production volumes might be boosted soon on the bright side because firms reported they're working on such lean inventories. Costs in manufacturing are slowing in their rise, unlike services. No construction numbers until Monday, but best guess for September GDP, based solely on these PMIs, would be 0.00%. Now, it feels terrible writing off a whole quarter, but it does appear the next 2 months, at least from a business perspective, will be cautious at best and probably very flat on the PMIs. Will the gilts cheer us up then? Do they ever? Well, the 5-year opened at 4.149% yield and closed at 4.125. So let's be thankful for small mercies. Nothing really moved the needle this week. It was the most boring, tiny, tight trading range within about 5 basis points top to bottom all week that I can remember. And I'm delighted about that. Don't get me wrong. Thursday's close was 4.14. That corresponded to 3.79 on the 5-year swap. 35 basis point discount rides on. Best guess for the next round of mortgage products being released, 5.8%, including amortization of the fees. How about the longs? Well, the 30-year opened the week at 5.526, closed at 5.503. It's almost identical in pattern to the 5-year. The yield curve got no steeper, no shallower. Most boring gilt update I've ever done in 3 years. And the irony of that in the 3-year anniversary of the lettuce's budget is quite incredible. But I'm delighted. I'll take this 2.4 basis point reduction each week for a whole year, please, for the next 12 months. That would be lovely. It also won't happen. But time to dive. Zoopla released a bit of a slobber knocker of a report, which I wanted to discuss about home building viability, and also released their house price report for the month, which I want to squeeze in alongside a data snapshot, as this was one of the more interesting weeks of the calendar, but it couldn't all be squeezed into the macro section. There's one further report from the Resolution Foundation about how much change or not delivering 1.5 million homes over the course of this parliament would make. I've no idea why anyone's still pretending that might happen, as we know it'll be at least 300,000 off by any sensible measure, and likely worse than that. Most think sort of 500 to 650,000 homes short of that 1.5 million. Data blast then. 93.63 thousand residential transactions for August, according to HMRC. 6% below the pre-pandemic average, but 1.7% higher than August 24. 1.7% down on the month before, which was July 25. But then it's August, remember. Scottish housing data had completions down 6% from Q2 2025 and starts down 3% year on year. Brick deliveries were 5.2% lower in Great Britain compared to August 2024. So certainly things have not picked up yet in terms of production value, or in Scotland, even in planning. Some more Scottish data as well, because they have the Scottish Landlord Register, of course, which is helpful for a bit more clarity of data. Registered properties to let in Scotland, they're down 0.9% since March this year, which was the recent peak, and the number of registered landlords is down 1.8% over that time period. Registered landlords are down 3.1% since the data series began in January 2022 in Scotland. The number of properties to let are actually up 2.5% over that same period, but they're down in 2025. So Scottish landlords did have 1.42 properties per registered landlord. Now they're at 1.5. You can see what the trend is there. Ultimately, smaller landlords are getting out of the game. But that's the actual data. We don't have that level of granularity of data in England as yet, because we don't have the nationwide licensing scheme apart from anything else. But don't worry, that's coming in the Renters' Rights Bill, of course, or the Renters' Rights Act, as it will be. Zoopla's price index, houses up 1.4% year on year for August 25, but some interesting stratification from Zoopla here. 11% drop in buyer demand for homes over £1 million. 2.8% average price inflation for houses worth under 200,000. What else do they see? Stable mortgage rates now, a widening in the north-south divide, advantage to the north, as it has been for a few years now. And they also find the time to blame the speculation about the budget for a worsening of activity in the £500,000 plus section. And I think this is a solid argument. Talking about changing tax around houses at 500,000 or above is going to affect demand, at least until people see what happens. The easiest thing in the world to do is nothing. It's just to wait, right? Unless you really need to move. So why wouldn't you wait until 2026? Anyway, stock levels are 20% higher than the average agent from 2023 and 8% up year on year. Demand for properties over 500k is down 4%. Sellers are not bothering listing a lot of this sort of stock either. Listings are down 9% on £1 million plus properties and 7% down on £500,000 plus properties. And this is why London and the South East are performing so poorly, of course. But you get what you get all the time in these situations. It's not a huge number of transactions that drastically reduce prices. People just don't transact, right? They just wait, and they wait for a bit of a recovery, wait for a better time, wait another year, wait another 2 years, etc., etc. So Zoopla has, of all the major indices that are ever published, been the most bearish about the quantum of house price rises. They've undercooked the ONS numbers by about 1 percentage point a year, roughly. But this might just be a compression between Zoopla asking prices and prices achieved, of course. We can't really measure that. Zoopla are kind of quite keen to point out they try not to talk about asking prices, but they absolutely are. Rightmove are much clearer about the fact they talk about asking prices. Zoopla, it's a bit of a muddy water, actually. It'd be much better if they did have clarity over the fact they're only discussing asking prices here. But of course, that might be consistent. That sort of Zoopla squeeze, or that asking price squeeze over the past 4 or 5 years, certainly since the market got cooler in 2022, might well be that is kind of how it's played out, right? So their 1.4% house rise breaks back to less than 0.5% in the south and 7.9% in Northern Ireland. Their best performing region in England is the northwest at 3.1%. Stamp is a drag on pricing. Well, of course it is. When taxes go up, the pie is being redistributed towards the government, and the difference is most certainly there, although it would be fractions of a percentage point. That drag plays out more in southern England as well, so it has not helped as affordability has been hit harder with higher, more normalised rates in the south than it has in the north. Where local markets average over 500k, prices are barely moving at all. And if you break the data down, the usual pattern is emerging. It isn't so much that prices aren't moving. As I've said already, people are not putting stuff up for sale. They won't sell at a discount, so they just don't trade. They don't need to move, right? They don't need to move that much. When you get to the individual postcode areas, what's doing well? Some cheaper areas of Scotland, Oldham, and then what's doing badly? A fair few areas of the southwest as it goes, alongside London, while Bournemouth tops the list of asking price cuts. First time I remember Bournemouth being at the bottom of that list for a long time. First time I remember anyone but Aberdeen being at the bottom of that list for many, many years, actually, to be honest with you. But there's no doubt in Zoopla's mind, and I'd agree with them, that double council tax for second homes is causing a big shift in attitude and behaviour. And there's a sideways reference to the mortgage affordability rule clarification from earlier in the year that cites, Zoopla say, homeowners borrowing 20% more than 6 months ago on the same mortgage rate. Well, this is a seismic shift. I mean, that's bigger than what I was suggesting and analysing. You know, the averages from the big banks were coming out about 28k more on an average loan of about 200k, which is obviously about 14%. They're saying 20%. I don't know where they got the figure from, but absolutely massive difference. And one thing you know about people who want to borrow money, especially motivated people like first-time buyers, if you lend them more, they'll take it. We've learned that lesson many, many times before, right? What's at the top of the English cities? 3.7% for Liverpool, 2.7% for Manchester. And then onto, from this report to their bombshell report on viability of house building. What's their headline? It's unviable to build houses across 48% of the country, and it's challenging across basically 2/3 of it, 64%. And of course, there's a disconnect that would always be the case. Where it's affordable to buy, it's not viable to build. And the flip side is obviously relevant. The report is a bit of a front end for a sales pitch because Zoopla are trying to sell their new homes product, which shows apparently a 30% uplift in quality leads for house builders. So if you're a house builder, check it out. But there's some stark data in the report. Build costs are up 17% on 2022. Sale prices are up 1%. Taylor Wimpey, a company that historically works on 1 sale per week per site, and in more recent years have come to accept 0.8 is more palatable. But when I looked in 2019 and in 2021, they achieved over 0.9 sales per week. You wouldn't really count 2020 because of the disruption, let's face it. But they've been achieving 0.65 sales per site per week on new builds in the past 9 weeks, which is down from 0.7 a week last year for the prevailing period, 0.64 excluding bulk deals. Pricing remained flat, according to their recent investor report. Year to date, the rate looks a bit better, 0.74 per week compared to 0.72 per week for the whole of 2024, but they are still knocking 10% slower than they used to be in new money. It's not a pace of sales that encourages house builders to do more. Back to Zoopla anyway. Well, with only 36% of the country viable for starter and family housing-led development, you get a good picture of the scale of the problem. It's an obvious but true statement. How can you make things more viable? Well, lower the cost of delivery or raise the price of the end product. But neither of these are happening because costs are increasing faster than house prices in the near future, according to pretty much everyone's forecasts. So what? Well, Zoopla tells us what many have been saying since the start of the government's rhetoric, which has now become build, baby, build under Steve Reed. Planning reforms help, but on their own, they're not enough to boost supply. They also drop the truth bomb that higher prices aren't the answer either. Meeting targets means new build doubling its market share of sales. Higher viability via higher prices just prices out more buyers. They mentioned that land values have softened and builder margins have narrowed, but the regulatory and policy costs are set to keep rising. Please take note, Mr. Reed. There are multiple mentions of the withdrawal of Help to Buy, but there would be in a report that's targeted towards house builders, of course. There was that deeper dive evidence presented by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation a couple of weeks back, showing not a strong impact after the withdrawal of Help to Buy. Zoopla correctly identifies the uncertainty in demand around corporate buyers and housing associations as well. In this same week, the Home Builders Federation has released a report referring back to their October 24 report, which detailed the 17,432 plus Section 106 homes that were uncontracted by RPs, which meant 139 home building sites were delayed at that time. Those figures have been refreshed and extrapolated across local authorities via Freedom of Information requests to 900 completed but unsold Section 106 units, 8,500 either under construction or due to start in the next 12 months that are not currently contracted, and 700 plus sites stalled or delayed in the past 3 years due to the inability to secure an RP to acquire the affordable units as of the middle of 2025. So this 8,500 is not an improvement on the 17,500, right? The latter figure was not time bound. That could have been over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years potentially. Whereas the 8,500 is just the next 12 months or the current strangulation in the pipeline, if you like. So Zoopla prescribes targeted action, and it's clear there are no quick fixes. Well, this is property after all, but there are ultimately 4 recommendations. Number 1, keep up momentum in planning and devolution reforms. I'm a bit sceptical about both of these, really. The former isn't showing results yet. I don't think politicians have a deep understanding of that, and they need results ultimately. And the latter is handing more power to the Reform Party. I'm assuming that May's elections next year look like May's elections this year. There's no reason, and there's nothing in the polling that suggests that won't be the case at the moment. Now, the wider world don't seem to have really twigged that yet, or certainly the world in Westminster, I should say. But I suspect an election in Wales, if it does go turquoise, will really give Westminster a bit of a reality check. Second recommendation, perform a regulatory review, and this badly needs to be listened to. The chat from Rachel Reeves about cutting regulation in order to stimulate growth. It's happened in the finance sector in the City of London. It's happened in mortgage affordability and lending, leading to this Zoopla's claimed 20% rise in what borrowers can borrow, which is obviously meaningful. Well, that needs to be applied here. The problem, as I can see it, is turning around legislation to be more careful about high-rise buildings. Brought in under the Conservatives and only very recently passed, really, in the grand scheme of things, the Building Safety Act, the Fire Safety Act. Optically, that's not a good look for Labour, regardless of how much it needs to be done to save the skin of urban development. Rachel did promise as far back as last year to look at the bats and newts situation and was quoted this August about being about to roll it back. But still we wait, as we do in politics. The Planning and Infrastructure Bill is supposedly going to get royal assent before Christmas. But timelines are never brought forward in these situations unless there's an election. Oh, how we wish. Anyway. Number 3 is targeted new funding for affordable supply. Put the money where it makes the most impact. Easy to say, not so easy to do, but it's likely a polite way of saying spend what's already been allocated. Local authorities return tens of millions to central government each year based on unspent right to buy receipts alone. They don't deliver the replacement houses, so the money goes back to central government. Number 4 is targeted demand support, which likely breaks back as money for the areas where prices are higher. They put the National Housing Bank in the crosshairs here as having a large role with respect to providing guarantees and the likes. And we know many billions, many tens of billions have been mentioned via the NHB. Now, politically less palatable, maybe, that's for sure. But what they're saying is target supply support where viability is marginal, first of all, and then where it is more challenging, and the other way round, target demand support where viability is okay, but affordability is the problem. So you'd have a kind of help to build, help to buy blend, depending on the part of the country, to an extent. Difficult to understand, probably much more effective, certainly more effective than a nationwide blanket policy, that's for sure. And how could you do this? Well, you could do this based on the end price of units, couldn't you, to an extent? Although you'd be very careful about where you set that end price of units and how you moved it over time. It's one possible way of doing it. Perhaps you've got 3 solutions. Something at the very much cheaper end, something at the very much more expensive end, and something for the squeezed middle part of things. I don't know. But governments don't have a great track record in this area, let's face it. And this is a long report, and I don't crack on line by line, don't worry. But I want to highlight some of the most interesting parts that are still yet to come. Annual private housing starts are down 40% since the start of 2022. They have increased off a low base in the first quarter of 2025. But this HBF analysis, this 17,432 affordable home starts that were stalled, That included over 100,000 private homes attached to those affordable homes that were also stalled. So that's 100,000 that are not taking place. One of the things that leapt out to me is the percentage of affordable homes with a 10% minimum expectation set in the NPPF may well need standardising across the country based on a metric rather than individual council preferences. Just a thought really that could lead, because individual councils can block viability one way or another, not worrying too much about their stat targets to an extent, although there are threats, or there were certainly threats from Rayner that you would take over this, that and the other. Not sure how Steve Reed's going to play that one. And there's often a lot of air and not a lot of action in these situations, isn't there? So Zoopla see the all-in cost of delivery on a typical 1,100 square foot new home at £307 a foot. That's about as useful as a national number ever is. But what does it lead to the following conclusions? Birmingham, unviable. Leeds, marginal. Bristol, viable, of course. Manchester and Sheffield, unviable. Liverpool, unviable. Leicester, marginal, right? So there's some big economic engines there and some scary words next to them. Zoopla takes that political line and says viability is finely balanced in many areas. There's an obvious north-south divide that's playing out there. Obviously, there are houses being built in those areas, but the average sale price of those houses is above the 75th percentile for houses in those areas. So if that's supposed to be a first-time buyer home, well, ridiculous to be in the 75th percentile, isn't it? You'd want it in the 25th percentile, realistically. So it's, again, we would then go into an argument about, is it the right sort of stock that's for sale? You know, a lot of stuff that's being built around Birmingham in the broader area will be more leafy, rural, 4-bed plus executive detached properties that are £1 million plus, right? Because they are viable, although in the current market it might be quite difficult to sell. So that's a different point of view, of course. Zoopla quotes the BCIS numbers, 2.5% to 3% over 2025. I bet that's been breached to the upside, and 2026. And then 14% build cost to go up by 2030. And I'll take the higher on that one, please, Matthew. Driven mostly by higher labour costs, they say. While the likes of myself and Savills are expecting higher house price progression than that, Zoopla are more bearish. I refer you back to my points around housing being, in recent historical context, pretty cheap, right? I think we'll be 10% more than that. I think we'll be 25% plus, but I don't believe that build costs will only go up 14%, especially when you add in the extra regulations, future home standard and all the rest of it. So, you know, the building safety levy got delayed, but delayed to 2026, not scrapped. It's helped a very small amount. The future home standard, you know, the press impact here was all future homes will have solar. It's going to cost more in percentage terms in a cheaper area. If that's £8,000 to the price of a house, right? If that end value is 200 grand versus 600 grand, it's self-evident that it's 3 times the percentage cost increase in a build, right? You know, they say 10% drops, Zoopla do. They've got, their data says, on greenfield land values since 2022. But if you know anything about development and the residual pricing of land, if you've had a cost increase of 17%, homes up 1%, and the cost of land down 10%, it's exceedingly unlikely unless the land value is a much larger part of the deal, and it's not normally. 10% is likely nowhere near enough of a haircut on stuff like that. So operating margins across the publicly published house builders over the past 2 years, 17%. Back in the 2010s, you were talking more like 30%. Long run targets are 20%, right? Zoopla argues higher prices are not the answer, but that's only a couple of breaths after pointing out that prices haven't moved in the past few years on new builds, and that hasn't helped. It's a fine balance, but I see their point. Don't target price repair, but it will happen and it won't be a negative factor. Zoopla sees 1 to 3% house price inflation in the near term and 1.1 to 1.2 million sales per year, which is pretty functional. And they're always bearish on house price inflation anyway. They do point out in their conclusion that the demand is there from both renters and buyers, and they believe they've laid out from a strategic perspective what needs to be done in order to achieve the goal. Now, all in all, I'd say this is a pretty good report, which I hope has the eyes and the attention of the Secretary of State for Housing. Now, the final one I wanted to look at this week was the Resolution Foundation's Q3 Housing Outlook. They look at the 1.5 million homes claim without saying what we all know isn't happening, and look at the impact. Their conclusion, a real step change, but not a game changer, which is self-evident, really. If you think 300,000 new households in a nation of over 30 million households would only be 1%, and 150,000 new households, much closer to the real number, in the incoming years is only 0.5%. I'm not sure whether there's a mature, developed economy anywhere in the world where this wouldn't be the case, to be honest. But remember, there are some surprising figures out there, albeit rounded to the nearest percentage point. Population in the UK was up 7% 2013 to 2023, whereas the number of homes was up by 9%. Most people would deny that was the case or would expect it was the other way around. However, those figures run to the fiscal year 2023, end of March 2023, and obviously since then there's been the very largest net migration figures the country has ever seen, alongside a massive slowdown in building since the 2022 budget. So ResF tells us that the 300,000 homes per year for the next 5 years would only stop the downward trend and only get us back to where we were in 2021. 10 years would make a difference. So that'd be 3 million homes in the next decade. We'd move from 535 homes per 1,000 adults to 554 homes per 1,000 adults. Now, I know what you're thinking. It won't happen. And I'm inclined to agree, of course. There's years of repair coming to the housing starts and still far too many obstacles in the way. And things like the future home standards I've already talked about just layer on more and more costs. However, if we did have a year, say 2027, where prices were up 6% nationwide, which is roughly where I'd throw a dart actually at this point in time, and there were lots of bullish forecasts then on the back of that about the next 5 years of the housing market, money to build would appear from nowhere and flood the market, believe me. ResF liked this metric of homes per 1,000 adults. There were 88 affordable homes per 1,000 adults in 2024, an all-time low. Right to buy was the trigger for the slide, of course, and then the lack of replacement has been the killer. The £39 billion commitment to building social homes sends this number to 91 by 2034. So all it does is arrest the decline and turn it up a little bit. I wonder if ResF will consider or know just how tough urban development is at this point in time. But we'll find out. The key points they want to get home: 300,000 homes a year need to be delivered and then sustained. They recognise this is unprecedented and that we've only hit 250,000 once since 1971. But they remain positive about the National Housing Bank, which has got a huge amount of money theoretically pledged behind it, and planning reforms and council mandatory target increases. As I say, that'll be more about enforcement. And I'm sure with some hostile councils, let's say, as reform take over more and more, will they be taking things to court on that basis? We'll soon find out just how much they want to ape the Trump game, I guess would be the way to talk about it. So the graph since 1971 that ResF produces around dwelling stock per 1,000 adults is perhaps one of the least intuitive I've seen for some time. The result, what I'm saying there is the results just do not look as you would have expected them to look. And therefore, I've shared it on this week's supplement, so you can check that out on my LinkedIn or via the Property and Propenomix website as well. Thanks to James again for hosting my articles on there. But people per household has been shrinking for a long time due to societal changes, longer lifespans, shifts away from getting married, cultural shifts away from multi-generational households that we never had in a strong way really in the UK, or we haven't had for 100 years or so anyway. In the real world, I'd expect we'd be under 525 dwellings per 1,000 adults by 2030. It's almost a guarantee. It might be a good time to point out the ResF assumptions are there. That's 1.5 million net additional dwellings. So that's zero knocked down. I don't know if Labour actually have said that in their finer detail. And we should remember at this point as well, of course, that although Labour said 1.5 million, it was like a bidding war. I think the Conservatives said 1.575 million. All of it was just a complete Swiss cheese, a complete lie. But you can think about this in the same way that Zoopla did when it comes to viability. What are the variables here? Number of people in the country and the number of dwellings. With far more people, because net migration figures released very recently have been tempered, of course, they're still massive from the 2023 and 2024 highs, and far fewer housing starts. There's a double bubble effect on this metric of homes per 1,000 heads. If you consider a population that went up 1.4% in 1 year alone, when it went up 7% in 10 years between 2013 and 2023, that metric alone shows you that 1 year had basically the impact of 2 years jammed together. And then ResF talk about the high number of people on local authority waiting. It's 1.3 million in 2024, the highest number since 2014, and the record high in temporary accommodation in March 2025, 131,000 households. They estimate that moving the ratio of dwellings per adult from 550 per 1,000 to 570 per 1,000 would decrease monthly rent by £34 a property. probably better expressed as a percentage, because it's going to be a big difference in Westminster and a small difference in West Bromwich. But there we go. Where is this metric lowest then? Well, Oxford, when it comes to larger areas, a little over 425 homes per 1,000 adults. Perhaps Oxford performs poorly because it's got a high per capita rate of students. Likewise, in Westminster and Kensington, there are plenty of dwellings per 1,000 people. But if MPs need to live there, not just MPs, of course, it's been a bit tongue-in-cheek there, then the fact there are 725 dwellings per 1,000 heads is not that helpful, because you've got so many visitors and overnight stayers and weekly stayers and blah, blah, blah. The rent correlation is pretty questionable. In reality, it's just a bit of a messy scatter graph, with the very biggest cities sitting at fewer than 500 dwellings per 1,000 heads, apart from London, but far higher rents in London, of course. So quite a lot more analysis would need to be done there to make it more meaningful, I think. Or it just would need to be more localized, and if you did it in the same way Zoopla have, in terms of looking at viable and unviable areas, that might be a good place to start. But anyway, ResF wants to push for building in the most productive areas of the country, but can't seem to decide between the cart and the horse. Their analysis on the back of this fairly weak correlation is not convincing. They end up suggesting building in areas of the country where we need to be more productive. I'm not sure that's the correct approach. We might need to be more productive first and then be building more, but it's not easy, depending if you are taking local steps at the same time to increase productivity, if it's a governmental or a high-level local authority decision. And they then come up with another conclusion that would raise eyebrows. There's more affordable housing relative to population in high-rent areas than low-rent areas. London, this is small a affordable, note. London's affordable stock ratio is 113 units per 1,000 adults, compared to the national average of 84. But London also has 20 households per 1,000, or 2%, in temporary accommodation, where the national average is 0.5. On average, 49 households per 1,000, 4.9%, are on social housing waiting lists. And then that number is 30% in Newham, and in Newham, more than 5% are in temporary accommodation. It's just mind-blowing what it's like there. Birmingham and Manchester both have 1.2% in temporary, and 10% in Bristol are on social waiting lists. Now, ResF don't touch the fact that the 1.5 million can't possibly happen by 2029, or forecast what will happen based on the more credible numbers. I haven't seen a better fist of it made by anyone yet, apart from Savills and their 840,000 estimate, which will, of course, make the current situation much worse, not better. And if the government don't listen to Zoopla or other meaningful recommendations, I'm sure they're currently busy reading reports about how to raise taxes, of course, and not spend more money, then these situations will simply have deteriorated further by the end of the decade. Now, there are always interesting considering metrics that are used in some of these think tank outputs, because this is what the government reads and what influences policy. I did have a flick through one DEMOS report, actually. I didn't include it in this week's supplement, about how and where taxes should go up. There was such a highly influential think tank during the Blair years, and I suspect they may well be being listened to a bit more by the more central members of the Labour Party at the moment. But unsurprisingly, very little thought was given to tax fairness. Tax the rich more, yawn, yawn, was popular, and there's little else to report from it. They're in favour of adding national insurance to landlords specifically, which is just so silly when it comes to the incidence of that and how it will affect tenants. But there we go. I see very limited point in doing too much budget forecasting, especially as with the loose lips around Westminster these days, because by late November, we're going to know what's going to go on anyway. And you're not going to be doing any long-term planning in the next 7.5 weeks. If you do, you'll end up what people ended up doing last year, and selling me stuff too cheaply before the budget, worrying about your own shadow, rather than just doing what I always advocate, which is, of course, keeping calm, always listening to the supplement and carrying on. Because there's going to be more opportunities this year as we see disposals, as we get the lead up to this budget, as we see the market, a little bit stagnant. The landscape's been set for a surefire bull run. It's going to be slowish and might take a little while before getting off the ground. I feel the heat will start to come perhaps the midway of next year. Again, that's there's a bit of dark art in predicting when the real pickup might start. But as soon as it starts, then the headlines start, then the actual prints start to show that house prices are going up, and then that's when things really start to move. The money starts to mobilise, and because it's one of the last bastions of solid returns that provide a bond-style return, so important for institutional investors, there's going to be a huge appetite to get involved in resi. But slowly improving at the moment is the mantra, and then it will be a case of here we go. So thanks for listening, folks. Don't forget to keep calm and carry on. Thanks for tuning in. And please, if you could, share, like, comment, subscribe. I'd appreciate it. Thanks again.